Welcome, online viewers. My name is Terence Maloon. There was a 29-year age difference between Ian Fairweather, born in 1891, and Tony Tuckson, born in 1920. However, they died within a year of each other, Tuckson in 1973, Fairweather in 1974. Although they were both English migrants who came to Australia as adults, we tend to think of them both as quintessentially Australian painters, not at all as castaways from the British art scene. Fairweather and Tuckson were both the products of an English boarding school education, something I know a little about myself, and I can recognize in them a Spartan self-sufficiency, as well as an ingrained dislike of hierarchy and formality, indeed the desire to avoid and even flee such things, to flee Mother England herself. And that is just what Tuckson and Fairweather did. They came to live in Australia, where they put down their roots, where they reinvented themselves as artists of this region. On the screen, an image of Fairweather very late in life in his shack on Bribie Island off the coast near Brisbane. And on the left, a photo taken in Tony Tuckson's studio, which was on the north shore of Sydney, surrounded by a couple of acres of bush. This photo was also of a man near to the end of his life. It's a photo Tuckson specifically requested his wife, Margaret, to take. I should note, perhaps for your benefit, the fact that no photographs exist of Tuckson directly involved in the act of painting. I've chosen these images because of the way they bring out differences between Fairweather's and Tuckson's approach, differences which you could say characterized two generations of painters. As you can see, Fairweather's paintings they waver on a threshold between figurative and abstract. The apparition of faces and bodies comes and goes in and out of the webbed tracery that is characteristic of his work, and this ambivalence of abstract and representational continues all the way to the end of Fairweather's productive life. Whereas in Tuckson's case, there's a moment when these phenomena all but disappear. I say all but disappear because in a subtle, perhaps even subliminal level, there are metaphorical undercurrents in Tuckson's work, and this again is a generational characteristic, but you'll get a better idea of what I'm driving at a bit later in this talk. Let's focus on the fact that even though Fairweather is painting on loose pieces of canvas or of cardboard tucked onto the wall, and even though he has several pictures going at once, they're all very definitely easel paintings, domestic in size, implying a frame, all contained within their boundaries. Whereas Tuckson's painting here is much larger, it has a feeling of openness and expansiveness, and the enlargement of size, or more properly speaking, of scale, permits these sweeping gestures that originate from the painter's elbow and shoulder, not just his wrist. In this lecture, we'll be examining the significance of those very basic physical differences. But before we do, I think I should say something about Fairweather's and Tuckson's commonality. As most of you know, Tony Tuckson was employed by the Art Gallery of New South Wales between 1950 and 1973, where he started as a cleaner, but within a few weeks became assistant to the director, then was promoted to deputy director, and then during the final phase of his career, he was also the gallery's curator of primitive art. That was the title he held at the time, and at the time, primitive art was a category incorporating everything from French medieval and Cycladic figurines to African, Aboriginal, and New Guinea art and artifacts. In fact, it was not so very uncommon in the early history of art museums for directors and curators to also be practicing artists. And indeed, when the director's job at the Art Gallery of New South Wales was advertised in 1944, one of the applicants for the job was none other than Ian Fairweather. It's a mind-boggling thought that if events had turned out differently, Fairweather and Tuckson could have been colleagues, respectively the director and deputy director of an Australian state art gallery. Yet perhaps it was for the best that this didn't occur, and maybe we're the richer for it, since the artists were able to develop independently of each other. The 29-year difference in age between Tuckson and Fairweather meant that Fairweather served in 2 world wars, Tuckson in only 1. The War of 1939 to 1945 brought their production, their very functioning as artists, to a complete halt. And when the war ended, the world, as they once knew it, had changed irrevocably. When the peace returned, Fairweather and Tuckson had to resurrect themselves as artists. How to begin again, how to pick up the loose threads, where to look for guidance and inspiration and direction. The traumatic experience of the war and the desire to renew and reconnect an engagement with the world of modern art. This had the effect of narrowing the generation gap and making Tuckson and Fairweather much more like contemporaries, at least throughout the latter 1940s and much of the 1950s. Fairweather began exhibiting in Sydney in 1949 and held exhibitions annually at the Macquarie Galleries. The work on the right is a small still life by, the work on the left is a small still life by Tuckson, painted around 1951, and on the right a Fairweather that Tuckson bought from a Macquarie Galleries exhibition in 1954. No doubt he would have assiduously followed all of Fairweather's exhibitions from 1949 onwards. Post-war Fairweather and post-war Tuckson, both of them displaced Englishmen, were committed to continuing the project of modern art, despite the fact that their chosen geographical location and new socio-cultural context was so very far from where their heads and hearts were as artists. Modern art was foreign. Modern art was unpopular. Modern art was more or less shunned in post-war Australia, apart from in specialized interest groups and small coteries of artists in the major cities. Here in the first half of the 1950s, Fairweather, painting in his shack on Bribie Island, has followed the star of Paul Gauguin into the South Pacific. But his reminiscences take him a long way north. He's remembering women he saw in China, women wearing large conical hats with a wooden yoke across their shoulders, carrying buckets of water. And he's remembering Picasso, a particular phase of Picasso, the savage, fracturing, and distorting of naturalistic representation in Picasso's early Cubist or pre-Cubist phase of 1907 to 1909. The leached out color and matte surfaces of Picasso's and Braque's analytic Cubist paintings, these were features of Cubism that had zero impact on Australian painting up till this point. Fairweather needed to reconnect with these precedents and needed to channel them into his paintings done on Bribie Island in order to re-establish his art on a sustainable basis. He needed to reconnect specifically with modernist primitivism, Picasso being an emblematic figure of this in the pre-war world. Tony Tuckson was performing a parallel channeling of Picasso in Sydney, though it was Picasso's paintings of the 1940s that Tuckson was emulating in these two canvases from around 1954. He's looking to Picasso and to the School of Paris and to modernist primitivism as touchstones of authentic modern art. As part of his work as deputy director, he gave lectures at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and in the course of one of those lectures, there is a justification of modernist primitivism. This is very revealing of his and of Ian Fairweather's preoccupations. Cézanne is often quoted as saying, "I shall remain the primitive of the path I have opened up." Gauguin, who painted his greatest pictures in the islands of the Pacific, said there should be a frank return to the beginning, that is to say, primitive art. Van Gogh, of all 19th century artists, used color in its finest state. He felt it expressed something in itself. These three artists have had a tremendous influence on 20th century art. Cézanne, his color and architectural construction in building his pictures. Gauguin, his color, his simplifications and symbolism. Van Gogh, his emotional and symbolic use of pure color. So there you have a rationale of primitivism straight from Tuckson's lips. Primitivism means essentially truth to materials, even a deliberate coarseness and opacity in the handling of materials. It means abstraction in the sense of simplicity, bareness of construction, fineness of color, which means the relative purity, a singing quality of color, and symbolism, which implies a state of mind, an emotional charge, some lyrical impulse, not necessarily something that it's possible to name. There's also a striking commonality in the lives and the legends of Cézanne, Gauguin, and Van Gogh that we might want to bear in mind in regard to Fairweather and Tuckson. These pioneering modernists, the three exemplary forerunners, were all loners. None of them had had a conventional art education. Each was gripped by a powerful compulsion to paint and draw. Recognition, success, sales came to all of them posthumously. Their unswerving dedication to their art and their indifference to worldly success singles them out as the patron saints of modern artists, who likewise do not expect to be understood, do not expect to please art collectors, do not expect to make a livelihood out of their work, do not even necessarily assume that some or even all of their work will ever be shown, at least not in their lifetimes. On the screen, a self-portrait drawing by Cézanne and one by Tony Tuckson. The other obvious commonality is that Gauguin, Cézanne, and Van Gogh were all associated with Paris, and in the post-war world, Tuckson, Fairweather, everybody, in fact, continued to regard Paris as the capital of modern art and to keep an eye out for new developments, for new stars to emerge from the post-war art world in Paris, for a new avant-garde to come on the scene. In 1953, 8 years after the end of World War II, the first survey exhibition of post-war French painting came to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, French Painting Today, including two 1940s Picasso paintings, so Tuckson was able to examine Picasso's brushwork at first hand and to assimilate something of its directness and vitality in his own painting. Also on view was a 1913 Braque still life, the first Cubist painting from this era ever to be shown in an Australian public gallery. There were 3 Legers, 2 Miros, and there was also a contingent of the new names, ostensibly rising stars of the post-war art scene: Bernard Buffet, Nicolas de Stael, Vieira de Silva, Hans Hartung, Pierre Soulages, Maurice Estève, Alfred Manessier. The exhibition caused a great deal of excitement in a Sydney art world which was starved for this kind of first-hand exposure to contemporary art coming from overseas. It's obvious that Tuckson and Fairweather shared their curiosity about, their fixation with, their alertness to the School of Paris with most other artists, with critics and modern art lovers of the time. But if you try to make a tally between Tuckson's output in the early to mid-1950s and the School of Paris artists who were featured in the French Painting Today exhibition, there's a puzzling disparity. The French artists who seem to have influenced Tuckson most were Jean Bazin and Jean Dubuffet, neither of whom was included in French Painting Today. And if you're going to try to locate Ian Fairweather's paintings in relation to the post-war School of Paris, which is something Murray Bale doesn't attempt to do in his monograph on Fairweather, the implicit connections or the marked affinities in his case are also with Bazin and Dubuffet. Let's start by Bazin, whose painting is in the middle of the screen. He was born in 1904, so he's much closer to Fairweather's age than Tuckson's. But like them, he's steeped in the trauma of war and has rehabilitated himself, trying to concentrate and synthesize what he wants to continue and to develop from pre-war modernist painting. The painting by Bazin in the center of the screen is from 1947, and flanking him on the left is a Fairweather and a Tuckson on the right, both from the 1950s. The drawing functions in all these works as a kind of circuitry, an artfully stylized tangle. There are suggestions of the line weaving in and out, lines overlapping in places, but the intention behind all three of these images is to emphasize the quality of density, the quality of frontality and flatness, to make the image entirely congruent with the surface of the paper or the surface of the canvas, so that at no point is the image allowed to go slack, to fall away, to allow any duality to prevail between foreground and background, or between figure and ground. In the early 1950s, Bazin was considered to be one of the leading lights of modern art, and he was also a bit of a polymath. He was an excellent writer, and much of what he wrote in the late 1940s and 50s would have been of great interest and would have been highly sympathetic to Fairweather's and Tuckson's preoccupations, if ever they chanced to read those publications. As with so many artists in the post-war years, the question of abstraction was a nettle to be grasped by Bazin. He, like Tuckson and Fairweather, would have been regarded by his contemporaries as a proponent of the new abstraction. But as with Fairweather, and as seems to have been the case with Tuckson in the first half of the 1950s, there are aspects of the commonly held notion of abstraction that made Bazin nervous, which he felt he needed to modify and correct. Ian Fairweather periodically would say much the same thing to visitors to his studio, but here's what Bazin wrote in 1947. This concentration, this increasing purity of means, this effort to surpass the concrete is what is commonly called abstraction. All art, the more that it develops, tends increasingly towards the abstract, which is a surpassing of the real, not a homesickness for the real. But for Bazin, there was no opposition possible between the concrete and the abstract, between naturalistic realism and his own kind of abstract painting. There was a whole continuum of art in between them. He preferred to call his own painting non-figurative. I think Fairweather would have agreed with him there. Non-figurative art was by no means antithetical to everyday perception, to experience of the natural world, since it is from the natural world that we all internalize rhythms, forces, structures, that's a quote from Bazin, which are ultimately challenged into works of art. Bazin said that one of the turning points of his artistic development occurred when he was out painting trees in a landscape and realized how he was giving the spaces between and behind the branches a positive valency, weaving foreground and background together. Of course, Bazin's drawing on the left reminds us very strongly of Cézanne, and once that notion occurs to us, we're prompted to see the dark lines in the painting on the right also as branches of trees, or we might compare the density and solidity of the composition to Cézanne's famous paintings of stone quarries. And of course, the blue of the sky piercing through trees and invading the foreground is a characteristic of these magnificent landscapes by Cézanne. That's a Fairweather on the left and a Tuckson on the right. These are two artists who love looking at trees, who love being surrounded by trees, who choose to live in the bush, and who derive the rhythms, forces, and structures of their paintings from things they see in the world. The ensemble of white brush marks of this large double-paneled work by Tuckson seems analogous to the beautifully abstracted choreography of Cézanne's watercolor on the left. And Fairweather's painting seems suffused by the spirit of the mangrove forests that surrounded his island home in semi-tropical Queensland. The Fairweather painting here is called Chi Tian Burns the Bugs. It's one of the works in his Drunken Buddha project. Quote, I started as a traditional painter, but I was always interested in abstract, and for a long time I worked on abstract lines. But I've decided that pure abstract doesn't suit me, and I'm trying to get back in my work to some representation. Fairweather told this to an interviewer in 1963, and to another 1962, and to another the following year. He said, painting for me is something of a tightrope act. It's between representation and the other thing, whatever that is, and it's difficult to keep one's balance. In fact, representation is always subsidiary to an abstract logic of composition, to the weaving together of figures and space, lines with their backgrounds, figurative elements, such as they are, have little or no independence of the ensemble in which they're embedded. The painting on the left by Fairweather, Cafe Tables, 1957. Here one wonders if he's remembering a scene in China or Paris or Melbourne, or whether the figures in the painting on the left are male or female, or whether these things should matter very much and affect our appreciation of the painting. In fact, the comparison with this example of Bazin's work serves to bring out the distinctiveness of Fairweather's method, the way that the layering of paint is much more apparent than in Bazin's case, and how the superimposition of layers serves to edit the underlying image, as well as adding to it, so that the mark that obliterates also becomes the mark that states. The mark that conceals also becomes the mark that discloses. It's a subtle and highly original approach to painting, and it has influenced a lot of Australian painters subsequently. Yet in these early Tucksons, there's nothing concealed, no mysterious bundles or skeins to unravel, and the woman, the couple, the home, the child, the intimation of erotic satisfaction and contentment of life are real, and indeed are extremely touching in their candor and their wry tenderness. Tuckson never exhibited these works in his lifetime. We think of the era of the early 1950s in Australia, the Menzies era, as very conservative, materialistic, suburban, and smug, and of course, the white Anglo heterosexual couple and the nuclear family, such as Tuckson portrayed it here, are ideologically charged. They're the normative unit of this conservative suburban Australia, though, of course, the manner in which Tuckson portrays those idols of familial bliss is completely unorthodox. Jean Dubuffet was also one of the big names during the early 1950s in the ranks of newly emerging artists of the School of Paris. As I said, he too is someone one needs to consider in rapport with both Fairweather and Tuckson. Tuckson is on record having said that for him, the two most important contemporary artists were Dubuffet and Jackson Pollock. And Fairweather, too, is reported in Murray Bale's monograph to have confessed to liking Dubuffet and Pollock in particular among contemporary painters. The leading question is, where, how, when did they get to know about Dubuffet? Neither Dubuffet nor Bazin were included in French Painting Today in 1953, yet we tend to greatly overestimate the isolation of Australia generally, and of Fairweather and Tuckson specifically. Both of them prided themselves on being informed. Daniel Thomas has said that one of the attractions for Tony Tuckson, working at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, was that it gave him access to art magazines, that it enabled him to keep abreast of what was going on abroad, knowing who was who in Paris, London, and New York. Similarly, Fairweather, who may have lived like a hobo in a shack on an island, nonetheless subscribed to papers and magazines that kept him informed about things that mattered most to him. Jean Dubuffet, born in 1901, nearer in age to Fairweather than Tuckson, was an outstanding representative of resurgent modernist primitivism in the immediate post-war years. He first showed in a mixed exhibition in New York in 1946 and was immediately seized upon by the American critic Clement Greenberg, who called him the most the most original painter to have come out of Paris since Miro. In 1947, Dubuffet had his first solo exhibition, exceptionally well received, particularly by his fellow artists. Jackson Pollock bought one of his gouaches. De Kooning was fascinated. De Kooning's series of women, these were painted subsequent to his exposure to Dubuffet. Make of that what you will. Rothko took a painting by Dubuffet into a class he was teaching to demonstrate to his students how a painting had the power to really hurt. In 1948, there was a picture in Life magazine. In 1952, there was an article in Art News magazine called Dubuffet Paints a Picture. So this information would certainly have become available to interested parties even as far afield as Australia. Fairweather or Tuckson could have had their interest fired by any of those notices and could, from that point onwards, have followed the trail. Of course, they would have realized that Dubuffet only seemed chaotic and cack-handed and punkish, that his works were beautifully organized, every speck in the right place, and that they were very sophisticated and inventive in their range of surface effects and their exploitation of methods and processes of generating images. As was the case with Bazin, Dubuffet was an extremely good communicator, and one might assume that his texts would have been most congenial to Fairweather and Tuckson if either of them had chanced to read them. In his writings, Dubuffet leaves us in no doubt that modern paintings have to be flat, 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 flat. Quote, "The task of painting is to adorn surfaces, and thus it addresses only two dimensions and excludes depth. The content of a painting can legitimately spring from the intrinsic qualities of its materials and the way they are manipulated. As Dubuffet put it, spirituality should borrow the language of materials. Each material has its language, is a language. It is not necessary to add a language or put a language at its service. Art should be born out of its materials, and the implements one uses should preserve their traces and also the traces of struggle between the implements and the materials. The artist should speak, but the implements and the materials should speak as well." And then there is a wonderful recommendation that would be, I imagine, music to the ears of painters such as Fairweather and Tuckson. Let's renounce fastidious works. They're contrary to human nature, contrary to cosmic rhythms. It's perverse to take pains where there's no need. It's pleasure and ease without stiffness and constraint that constitute grace in every human gesture. Much of the character and indeed the grace of Fairweather and Tuckson comes from the fact that they're not neat freaks, and neither was Dubuffet, of course. On the left, a 1945 drawing by Dubuffet with those naive potato-like figures, comparable in their primitive clunkiness to the seemingly artless figures in Fairweather's painting on the right. Dubuffet wrote, "I like the sparse, I like the embryonic, the badly made, the imperfect, the muddled." Dubuffet declared this towards the end of a treatise he published in 1946. Why did he like those things? Because he hated slickness. He hated self-consciousness. He hated show-offs. He hated people who made art to please, to sell, to compete, to win. He hated every form of smarminess and a narcissistic self-regard. The true skill of an artist lay in concealing expertise, lay in concealing conventionality, lay in concealing good taste, etc. Let's look at a couple of the early works that helped rocket Dubuffet to success in Paris and New York during the late 1940s. This is a painting from 1946, and that's what it looks like in black and white. Let's not forget that most of the paintings Fairweather and Tuckson saw reproduced in art magazines would have been in black and white. There was a Fairweather painting in the upper left and a Tuckson painting at the lower right, where you can see this all overness, this lack of a focal center, the evened out appearance, the facade-like qualities that all of these works have in common. On the top row, painting by Jackson Pollock on the left and by de Kooning on the right, with a Fairweather and Tuckson in the lower row. In 1948, New York critic Clement Greenberg was struck by how many contemporary painters had converged in their respective approaches to paintings. The kind of modern painting they were proposing was dense. Their tendency, he wrote, was to weave the work into a tight mesh whose principle of formal unity is contained and recapitulated in every thread, so that we find the essence of the whole work in every one of its parts. That's a marvelous description which could be applicable not only to Tuckson and Fairweather, but other Australian artists such as Godfrey Miller and John Passmore, and it also applies to American artists of the same era, Mark Tobey, and perhaps most pertinently of all, to Jackson Pollock, an artist very close to Greenberg's heart. The context of this description was an essay published in April 1948 called The Crisis of the Easel Picture. Of course, easel painting and all of its conventional appurtenances, figuration, pictorial illusion, a tightly controlled, reined-in technique, and picturesqueness in general had always been the stock-in-trade of Australian art, prescribed by the art market, by the museum world, and by art education. The assumption that easel painting might require rethinking, let alone that it could be surpassed or circumvented in some way, would probably be regarded as an idea far too dangerous to entertain by an Australian artist or art critic. But it was an idea that artists themselves were entertaining. In 1952, Henri Matisse, then in his sublime old age, still pumping out one radiantly beautiful masterpiece after another, was asked whether he thought easel painting had much of a future, and he replied, "I think one day easel painting will no longer exist because of changing customs. There will be mural painting. Colors win you over more and more. A certain blue enters your soul. A certain red has an effect on your blood pressure. A certain color tones you up. It's the concentration of timbres. A new era is opening." What was there about this new era that made it different from the previous one? As Matisse's statement implied, there was a desire for greater immediacy, greater vividness, and greater concreteness. Artists were seeking a more visceral engagement with the actuality, with the stuff of their art. And this reorientation of their priorities affected viewers as well. Sorry about the wonky images photographed on my phone of two facing pages in an exhibition catalogue of works from the Hassel collection, a Fairweather on the left, a Tuckson on the right, both from 1956 or thereabouts, both more or less the same size, a study in similarity and difference. But it's at this point where I think the generational divide between Fairweather and Tuckson reopened. In Greenberg's 1948 essay, he opined that when painting becomes so congested and opaque, it needs to get bigger and alter its relation to the body and the body's movements. And Tuckson, along with some other Australian painters such as John Olsen and Peter Upward, effected precisely this breakthrough at the end of the 1950s and early 1960s. Tuckson, working in total seclusion, was creating works which seem progressively to ratchet up his frustrations. They're very subtle and beautiful works. In fact, when you get to know how to look at them, yet they do seem to epitomize what it is to be pent up, what it is to be disquieted, what it is to be ill at ease. The edges of the painting, the framing within the framing, which becomes such a mannerism within the latter-day school of Paris, and which we see so often in Fairweather, strikes as a kind of compounded tautology of the conventions of easel painting, emphasizing their smallness, their boundedness, to the point of claustrophobia. In the 1950s, Tuckson's works grow dense and tumultuous with pent-up energy, and then comes a moment where they break out. His later paintings are open fields, spacious and radiant. They're field paintings, they're action paintings, in many respects because they remained well informed about what was going on in the Northern Hemisphere, in Paris, London, and New York. Fairweather and Tuckson were channeling the vital currents of modernist painting into their art much more effectively than most of their peers in Australia. The dwindling achievements of the School of Paris and the concomitant crises of the easel picture, these were indeed dramatized in their art. The burgeoning of painting in New York and the remarkable achievements of the post-war generation of American artists, Fairweather's and Tuckson's contemporaries, they were aware of these things happening before most others had gotten onto them. There's a precise moment in Australia when reality dawned that the prestige of the School of Paris was no longer justifiable, that Paris had died as the center of world art. This happened in July 1958 when John Olsen wrote a letter from Paris for the Contemporary Art Society broadsheet and made the dramatic announcement. Let me say here and now, the School of Paris is at its lowest ebb ever. Whatever your prejudice, figurative or non-figurative, One can stay weeks or months on end and not see anything worthwhile. In your first week, you would wipe aside Riopelle, Saint-Gier, and even Soulage. Dubuffet is undoubtedly the most interesting of the newer generations, original and influencing many. He rejoices in his wonderful surfaces and assures one that it is still possible to create wittily. That's an Olsen on the left and a Dubuffet on the right. The following month, the editor of the Contemporary Art Society broadsheet, Elwyn Lynn, wrote his response to Olsen's letters and fastened particularly on Olsen's mention of Dubuffet. It should not be surprising that artists have turned their backs on accepted behavior, that Dubuffet epitomizes their attitudes. His art brut, his raw art, is concerned with matière, with sand, stone, sponges, steel wool, asphalt, lava, cement, plaster, roots, clinker, and charcoal. My art, he says, is the rehabilitation of damaged goods. This is war on the decorative, a campaign against the slick, the received, and an attempt to breach the walls of normal, rational methods to reveal the inner keep of art. That's a Dubuffet on the left and a Tuckson on the right. And this was indeed the ethos that Fairweather and Tuckson shared, and shared not only with their great contemporaries abroad, but shared with each other. I like the sparse. I like the embryonic, the badly made, the imperfect, the muddled. That's Dubuffet's statement. What an extraordinary rallying point and call to arms for the post-war generation of artists. And what a thrilling aesthetic adventures resulted from their collective transgression of slickness, tastefulness, neatness, and niceness. Thank you for your interest.